Now let's have a look at the merge node. A typical example would be we have a background plate which obviously has a bounding box that is as big as the format because we need to see all the pixels, and let's say we want to replace a tiny little part like this street sign here. I tracked the street sign and attached a checkerboard just as an example for now, and you'll see how it sort of matches the motion in the plate. And if we look at the tracked checkerboard, you'll see the bounding box is nice and tight because the checkerboard generates its own bounding box, which is then transformed along by the transform node and the tracker node. And once it wanders outside of frame, it still preserves its pixel data because there is no clipping happening in this part of the tree. So that's usually good news. However, if you merge this on top of your background plate with the default settings, you'll see that the bounding box starts growing and growing and growing as the checkerboard leaves frame. So that means the more we progress in the timeline, the bigger the bounding box is going to get. And now we're sort of about twice the size of our HD frame, which is a huge waste of resources. And quite often artists aren't aware of this and they slam on more effects and more filters and everything just comes to a grinding halt. So the easiest way to fix this is not to attach another crop node to recrop the bounding box back to the format, but simply to use the merge node's set bbox2 knob in the most efficient way. It's very similar to the clip2 knob in the Bezier node. In this case, again, it allows a union of the bounding box coming from input A and the bounding box coming from input B. But in this case, we're really only interested in the bounding box of input B. So we'll set this knob to B. The bounding box will stay as is no matter where that checkerboard goes to, and we can be sure that we're working only with the pixels that we actually need in our comp. If you look at the other values, they're very similar to the Bezier's clip2 knob, and they're pretty self-explanatory. There are also some dedicated nodes in Nuke for the bounding box workflow, one of which is the copy bbox node. Let's have a look at that. You'll see my beauty render with a baked-in bounding box and a secondary pass that doesn't have a bounding box. And to get the bounding box from one to the other node, I can simply use a copy bbox node found in the merge menu. And here's my bounding box without much hassle. There's also the adjust bounding box node, which you can find in the transform menu, which will let you add or subtract a certain amount of pixels on each side of the bounding box, like so. And this actually brings us to a related issue. If you subtract pixels to make colored pixel inside the bounding box actually touch the inside of the bounding box, they will repeat outside. There's also the option of black outside, which you can find in many nodes in Nuke, and let's have a quick look at that as it's slightly related to the bounding box concept. For example, I've got a checkerboard and I'll attach a transform node and scale the whole thing down. Now you'll see a smaller checkerboard on black as you would expect. However, if you look closely, and let me just reset the scale here so the transform doesn't do anything. If you closely look at the bounding box coordinates in the upper right corner here, you'll see that just by attaching the transform node, our bounding box just increased by a single pixel into all directions. And that's the black outside option in the transform node. If I turn this off, you'll see the bounding box stays as is, and if I turn it on, it will grow to include a single black pixel all around. And including a single black pixel will make sure that we get black outside of our checkerboard. Whereas if I uncheck it, you'll see that even though we're scaling it down, we're now repeating edge pixels, which sometimes can be very useful. For example, what if I want to scale this up a little bit? And the black outside is checked by default, and now I want to apply a huge blur. You'll see in this example that we're actually getting vignetting, and that's because the bounding box includes a single black pixel through the black outside option, and that black pixel becomes part of the filter process. If we don't want this, but we actually want a nice average color over the whole frame, we need to uncheck black outside to make sure that the pixels repeat at the edge, and therefore the blur node uses some useful color information for its operation. There's also a dedicated black outside node in the transform menu, and the reason for it being in the transform menu is, as you saw, that it actually modifies the bounding box. So that's a bounding box in a nutshell. Once again, make sure as you go that you always are aware of what the bounding box does when you combine images, and that you always work with the most efficient bounding box that you can to keep your comps efficient.